He was 6 years old when he started 12-hour shifts in a cotton mill. He never spent a day in a classroom. He couldn't even read his own name in a headline. By 23, people were calling him the greatest natural hitter the game had ever seen. Then a sports writer put 5 words in a kid's mouth outside a courthouse, words that followed him into his grave. A commissioner banned him for life for throwing the 1919 World Series. Problem is, he hit .375 that series and didn't make a single error. He spent the next 30 years playing baseball under other men's names in cow pastures across the South. He died 2 weeks before his shot at national television, and it took baseball 74 years after his death to admit the punishment maybe shouldn't have been forever. This is the story everyone thinks they know because of one line a kid supposedly said outside a courthouse. Almost none of it happened the way the legend says. This is Shoeless Joe Jackson's real story. Number 1. The mill boy nobody expected to matter. Joseph Jefferson Jackson was born July 16, 1888, in Pickens County, South Carolina, into a family with almost nothing. His father worked in the cotton mills, and by the time Joe was 6, he was working there too, hauling and hauling for 12 hours a day, inside a building where the air itself was dangerous to breathe. There was no time for school. There would never be time for school. Joe Jackson grew up, lived his whole career, and died without ever learning to read or write more than his own signature. He said it himself, plainly, without shame. He didn't think you needed schooling to play the game well. And he was right, in the most literal sense possible. By age 13, he was good enough that a mill owner asked his mother if he could play on the company baseball team. She said yes. He became the youngest player on that roster, earning $2.50 a Saturday to do the one thing that came naturally to a boy who'd been given almost nothing else. Nobody in that mill town could have guessed that the illiterate kid hauling cotton would end up compared within a decade to Ty Cobb and later to Babe Ruth. But baseball, unlike everything else in Joe Jackson's life so far, didn't care where he came from. It only cared what he could do with a bat in his hands. And what he could do with a bat in his hands was about to become the stuff of legend. Number 2. The name that came from an insult and the bat that came from a tree. Here's the part almost everyone gets slightly wrong. The nickname Shoeless Joe didn't come from Jackson refusing to wear shoes out of poverty or superstition the way the myth usually goes. It came from one single painful afternoon. But before that, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on future videos like this one, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this. Playing in a minor league game with a brand new pair of spikes that had torn his feet raw with blisters, Jackson took the shoes off mid-game just to make it through. Playing in his socks, he ripped a base-clearing triple, and an opposing fan, watching a grown man round the bases without shoes on, shouted out something cruder than the polite version of the story usually admits. A sports writer overheard it, printed a cleaned-up version, and Shoeless Joe was born from a moment of humiliation that got turned into a legend. The bat is just as much a part of the myth. Jackson carved and commissioned a 36-inch, 48-ounce hickory bat he called Black Betsy, and it became almost as famous as the man swinging it. He used that same bat for his entire career. Through the majors and later through the decades of baseball, he wasn't supposed to be allowed to play anymore. In his rookie season in 1911, playing for Cleveland, he hit .410. That number still stands as a rookie record. It still stands as a franchise record for that team over 100 years later. He was 23 years old, couldn't read a contract, and was already playing at a level almost nobody in the sport's history has ever touched. That was just the beginning. Number 3, the best hitter alive, according to the people who would know. Jackson finished his career with a batting average of .356. To put that in perspective, it's the 3rd highest career batting average in Major League history, behind only Ty Cobb and Rogers Hornsby. He led the American League in triples 3 separate times. He was fast, he had one of the strongest throwing arms anyone had ever clocked from the outfield, and by the mid-1910s, he wasn't just a good player, he was being talked about as maybe the best there was. Ty Cobb, who feuded with almost everyone and respected almost nobody, respected Jackson's swing. And the story that's followed Jackson for a century, repeated by teammates, by historians, by the man himself, is that a young Babe Ruth studied Jackson's mechanics and modeled his own swing after it. The player who would go on to redefine the entire sport was, by his own admission, learning from an illiterate mill kid from South Carolina. In 1917, Jackson helped lead the Chicago White Sox to a World Series championship. He was in his prime. He was rich by the standards of where he'd come from. He had every reason to believe the best years of his career and his life were still ahead of him. 2 years later, in 1919, everything he'd built collapsed in 8 games. Number 4, 1919, The Fix. The details of the Black Sox scandal have been picked apart for over 100 years, but the bones of it are these. A group of Chicago White Sox players, unhappy with what they were being paid by team owner Charles Comiskey, allegedly agreed to intentionally lose the 1919 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds in exchange for money from gamblers. 8 players were eventually implicated. Jackson was one of them. Here's where it gets complicated, and where the case against him has never been as clean as the legend suggests. Jackson batted .375 across that 8-game series, the highest average of any player on either team. He hit the series' only home run. He made 0 fielding errors. If Joe Jackson was trying to lose on purpose, he was doing a historically bad job of it, while somehow also playing the best baseball of anyone on the field. What's not in dispute is that Jackson received $5,000 from The Fix, money he later said he tried to give back, unsuccessfully, more than once. What's still argued, more than a century later, is whether accepting that money after the fact makes him a co-conspirator, or whether he was a player who knew something dirty was happening around him, didn't report it, took money he probably shouldn't have, and then went out and played to win anyway. There's no clean answer. That's exactly why people are still fighting about it. The men behind the money weren't small time. The scheme traced back to a New York gambling kingpin named Arnold Rothstein, known across the underworld as the Big Bankroll, a man who reportedly placed roughly $250,000 in bets on Cincinnati to win. Rothstein was careful and smart, and he never let his own name get directly attached to the deal. He worked through intermediaries, a former featherweight boxing champion named Abe Attell, a small-time gambler named Sports Sullivan, and a has-been pitcher named Bill Burns. Men whose job was to make promises to ballplayers and hope Rothstein's money and reputation would be enough to make those promises believable. It worked. 8 players ended up implicated. Jackson, pitcher Eddie Sacote, first baseman Chick Gandil, outfielder Happy Felsch, infielder Swede Risberg, and Fred McMullen, pitcher Lefty Williams, and third baseman Buck Weaver, who always insisted he'd backed out of the deal before the series even started, and simply hadn't reported what he knew. When Rothstein himself was called before the grand jury, he denied everything and pointed the finger at Attell. His actual testimony mysteriously disappeared from the case file soon after. He was never charged with anything. Number 5. The Grand Jury Room and the Confession He Couldn't Read. On September 28, 1920, teammate Eddie Sacote broke down and confessed to a grand jury investigating the scandal. The next day, it was Jackson's turn. His actual word-for-word grand jury testimony survives, and some of it is genuinely damning. At one point, asked directly whether he and his teammates threw a specific game, Jackson answered simply, "We went ahead and threw the second game." Other exchanges have him denying he made intentional errors, insisting he played every at-bat and every base to win. The uncomfortable truth historians have dug into since is that Jackson, barely literate, reportedly having been drinking, and represented that day by Comiskey's own lawyer rather than someone looking out for his interests, gave a statement that was detailed, specific, and badly damaging to himself, in ways some researchers believe he may not have fully understood the weight of. He spent the rest of his life insisting he'd been misled about what that confession actually meant. And then there's a line everybody actually remembers, the one that turned the whole scandal into American folklore. A heartbroken kid supposedly grabbing Jackson's sleeve outside the courthouse and begging him, "Say it ain't so, Joe." It's one of the most famous quotes in American sports history, and according to the historians who've actually gone looking for it, it almost certainly never happened. There's no court record of it. There's film footage of Jackson leaving that courthouse flanked by deputies through a packed crowd, and no boy grabbing his sleeve anywhere in it. The line traces back to a newspaper sob story written by a sportswriter trying to sell papers. That fabricated quote didn't just haunt Jackson personally, it built the emotional foundation for almost everything written about the scandal afterward, including the sources most people learned this story from in the first place. Author Elliot Asinoff's book on the scandal and the 1988 film adapted from it both leaned hard on the tragedy of a betrayed public and a heartbroken kid, dramatizing scenes and conversations that historians have since found little or no documentary evidence for. Decades of researchers digging back through original trial transcripts, hotel records, and court exhibits have found the real story to be messier, less cinematic, and far less certain than the legend that grew up around it. Number 6. Acquitted in court, banned anyway. In 1921, a Chicago jury heard the case against all 8 accused players and acquitted every single one of them. The courtroom reportedly erupted. By the letter of the law, Joe Jackson walked out a free man. It didn't matter. Baseball had just installed its first ever commissioner, a stern former federal judge named Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and Landis had zero interest in what a jury decided. The next day, the very next day, he issued a ruling that would define the rest of Jackson's life. Any player who threw a game, agreed to throw a game, or sat in a room where throwing a game was discussed and said nothing about it, would never play professional baseball again. Not a suspension, not a fine, forever. Jackson was 32 years old. He just signed a new 3-year contract before the scandal broke. His career in the game he'd spent his entire life mastering was simply over by decree, regardless of what any court of law had decided. He didn't go quietly. In 1924, Jackson sued Comiskey for the back pay from that voided contract, and the case actually went to trial in Milwaukee, where transcripts, only made fully public in recent years, dug even further into what really happened in 1919. A jury sided with Jackson and awarded him more than $16,000. The judge overruled the jury's decision and had Jackson jailed on a perjury charge for allegedly contradicting his own grand jury testimony. He then acquitted by one jury, banned anyway, awarded money by a second jury, and then arrested over the same case for a third time. If you're looking for a single moment that captures how tangled and unresolved this entire saga has always been, that's probably it. Number 7. 30 years playing under names that weren't his. Banned from the only professional stage that mattered, Jackson didn't quit the game. He couldn't. He spent the better part of the next 2 decades barnstorming through semi-pro leagues across Georgia and the Carolinas, sometimes under his own name, sometimes under someone else's, because baseball was simply the thing he knew how to do and the thing he loved doing, sanctioned or not. In 1941, at 53 years old, he was still stepping up to the plate at exhibition games and hitting home runs. He and his wife Katie, who could read and handled every contract and ledger Joe couldn't, opened the dry cleaning business in Savannah, then a barbecue restaurant back home in Greenville, and eventually a liquor store that became the steady center of the rest of his life. One story from behind that counter has outlived almost everything else about his post-baseball years. Ty Cobb walked into Jackson's liquor store one day with sportswriter Grantland Rice, and Jackson gave no sign he recognized his old rival. Confused, Cobb finally asked him directly if he knew who he was. Jackson's answer was quiet and devastating. Of course he knew him. He just wasn't sure Cobb still wanted to be known by him. A lot of people, he said, didn't anymore. That was the shape of the rest of Joe Jackson's life. Respected by the people who actually knew him in Greenville, treated as radioactive by the sport that had made him famous. Number 8. He died 2 weeks before his television moment. In September 1951, Cleveland fans voted Jackson into the team's own Hall of Fame, and the publicity around it led to an invitation to appear on Ed Sullivan's national television show. After 30 years of being erased from the game at the highest level, Joe Jackson was finally about to get a real, public, national moment of recognition. He never made it. 2 weeks before the appearance, he suffered a heart attack. He died at home in Greenville on December 5, 1951, at 64 years old. He was buried in Woodlawn Memorial Park, in the same town where he'd once hauled cotton for 12 hours a day as a 6-year-old, still insisting to the very end that he'd never thrown a single game. For the rest of the 20th century, his case sat frozen. Every push to get him into the Baseball Hall of Fame ran into the same wall. the lifetime ban Landis handed down never actually ended because Jackson never lived long enough to serve out a sentence that was designed to never be served out. Number 9. The ruling that finally moved, 74 years too late for him to see it. For decades, commissioner after commissioner declined to touch the ban. Then, in May 2025, current commissioner Rob Manfred made a decision that changed everything for Jackson's legacy, even though it came more than 7 decades after his death. Manfred ruled that the punishment for the permanently ineligible list should end when a player dies, reasoning that a person who is no longer alive can't threaten the integrity of the game going forward. That decision reinstated Jackson, along with hit king Pete Rose, and more than a dozen other long-banned players. For the first time since 1921, Shoeless Joe Jackson was no longer on baseball's permanently ineligible list. He's now eligible for consideration by the Classic Baseball Era Committee, which meets again in 2027 to decide who gets inducted in 2028. It's not a guarantee. It's not the plaque in Cooperstown that his family and his hometown and generations of defenders have been fighting for since before most of them were even born. But it's the first real crack in a wall that stood untouched for over 100 years. Number 10. The version of him that never actually existed. Here's a strange twist. While the real Joe Jackson spent decades locked out of the sport, a fictional version of him was quietly becoming more famous than the man himself. Author W.P. Kinsella built his 1982 novel Shoeless Joe around the ghost of Jackson returning to play baseball one more time, and that novel became the movie Field of Dreams, one of the most beloved baseball films ever made. Millions of people who've never read a single line of his actual grand jury testimony know the phrase, "If you build it, he will come," and picture Jackson walking out of an Iowa cornfield in soft, forgiving light. The 1988 film 8 Men Out told a harder, more literal version of the scandal itself, dramatizing the underworld dealings of Rothstein and Attell, and the slow unraveling of 8 men's careers. Between the two films, Jackson became one of the rare, real historical figures who exists almost as two separate people in the public imagination: the tragic myth in the cornfield, and the actual man who ran a liquor store on Pendleton Street in Greenville and never stopped insisting he was innocent. Today, that hometown still hasn't let go of him. There's a statue of Jackson in downtown Greenville. His house, once left to rot as an overgrown lot, was eventually moved and restored as a Shoeless Joe Jackson museum, preserving the ledgers, photographs, and everyday relics of the 30 years he spent as a private citizen after baseball cast him out. Family members who actually knew him have spent their lives telling anyone who'll listen the same thing he told them. He gave everything he had on that field, every single game. This is the part almost nobody puts together. Joe Jackson was never the cartoon villain the scandal turned him into, and he was never the flawless victim his defenders sometimes want him to be either. He was a kid who started working 12-hour mill shifts before he was old enough to read, who became one of the greatest hitters the sport has ever produced without ever fully learning how the business side of that sport actually worked. He signed the confession he probably didn't fully understand. He took money he said he tried to return. He also hit .375 with 0 errors in the exact series he supposedly threw. And he spent the next 30 years of his life still showing up to play the same game that had already told him he wasn't wanted in it anymore. The most famous words connected to his name were most likely never spoken to him at all, and the organization that erased him took so long to reconsider that decision, it finally arrived 74 years after there was nobody left alive to hear it. If this story moved you, hit the like button. Drop a comment with what you think really happened in that clubhouse in 1919. Innocent bystander, willing participant, or something messier in between. We read everyone. And subscribe, because the next name we're covering was also banned by the same sport that once called him one of the greatest to ever play it. And his story ends even stranger than this one. Until then, keep swinging.